Thank you very much to the Honorable Controller and Auditor General of India, Mr. Sharma, for having invited me to associate with this Commonwealth Conference of the Auditor Generals, which India is privileged to host. Amongst various experiences of the Commonwealth that have benefited India over the last 7 decades of India's independence, the CAG, which started as an institution 150 years ago, has institutionalized a mechanism which has earned a great appreciation and respect in India. It's an institution which has improved upon the quality of governance in India, because every time as a part of the executive that we in the government act, one of the overriding considerations which weighs in our minds is that every decision we take, every rationale that we lay down, at some stage through the magnifying glass will be re-observed by another institution. And in order to comply with a potential future test that it will be put to, is a great deterrent which has added to responsible governance in India. And I think it's a great privilege for India to have hosted this convention, and I'm sure all of us will benefit from the mutual experiences which member countries of the Commonwealth will share, considering technology as a new tool for the auditing purposes itself. I've been requested by the Honorable CAG to speak on the Indian economy, and therefore conscious of the fact that our international delegates would like to familiarize themselves with how we've evolved to the present situation. Just a little basic background. Seven decades ago, we started with a more regulated model of economy. That was a time where private investment in India was inadequate, resources were meager, and therefore the state had taken upon itself the responsibility of creating basic institutions. And the large industries which also came up, except the ones which existed from a long time ago, were institutions which were really set up by the state. And that's the model on which we kept progressing. Needless to say that that model itself, because of inherent inadequacy of resources in India, had its own deficiencies. But it did create a basic infrastructure for industrial development which was required in India. India is predominantly an economy which was agrarian in character, and at that stage More than 80% of the people were involved in agriculture as a source of livelihood. And in fact, underemployment in that field itself was writ large. The inadequacies of that system were being felt in the decades of the 70s and the 80s. And finally, it was in the early 90s, 1991, that we decided to make a break with that more regulated planning which we had earlier. We evolved into a new model. And that's when the turning point for the liberalization of the Indian economy itself grew. When we look back the last 26 years, it's been more than a satisfying journey for India. Initially, we started this whole process with a major step of delicensing, not requiring any state permissions to set up an industry, which in the pre-91 regime was highly regulated. We started off by liberalizing our currency laws. We opened up, partly, subject to certain conditionalities, our doors for international investment, which indeed started flowing in. We started rationalizing our taxation rates and tariffs, which were initially very high. That made our products more competitive. And we undertook that journey with a good initial impact. The immediate effect of this was that a pre-91 economy, which was predominantly an economy of shortages, suddenly with year after year started witnessing most of those shortages disappear. Our growth rates, which were less than modest in the pre-91, suddenly started picking up. And we started off initially with a growth of about 6 to 7%. And then successive governments, year after year, started taking strides in continuing that process forward. The success of that experiment itself had emboldened governments. The next stage, of course, was rationalization of direct taxes, which were indeed very high in India. They were brought down to international levels, opening up important sectors which had all been reserved for government monopolies, services sectors like the telecommunications, etc., and opening up did help. And suddenly we found our core competence in sectors like the information technology, telecom, automobiles, pharmaceuticals. These became success stories which got to be replicated. That was when the next big step was required. And the next big step was, how do we make a leap forward as far as creation of better infrastructure is concerned? And then started programs like the creation of national highways, improvement in the air connectivity system, particularly with the introduction of private players, increase in the capacity of ports, and these strides started moving forward. The global boom period from 2003 to 2008 really saw this economy pick up at greater heights. And with the support of the global winds behind us, we now moved from that 6%, 6.5% growth rate upwards towards 7, 8, and even 9% in given years. our average growth rates had become much higher. And I think what was most significant also was the resilience capacity that the Indian economy had. Even the shocks and the slowdowns, whether it was the East Asian economic crisis or it was the 2008 crisis globally, it had its impact, but the impact on India somewhat was limited because we managed to build firewalls of internal demand and internal capacity within the economy itself. There was, by Indian standards, a slowdown post-2010 for a brief period. But slowdown by our own standards was also still 5 to 6.5% growth rate. And notwithstanding the global slowdown which was witnessed in the last 3 to 4 years, India became a case where neither were too many voices of protectionism within the domestic economy heard, nor was there any slowdown as far as the reform process was concerned. And therefore, in the last few years, we've witnessed a series of steps which have been taken. And I think what stands out in India most importantly is that we've now reached a stage where the aspirational desire of the Indian people is so high that there is today a popular support behind the reform process. In fact, obstructions to reforms has become most minimal. The voices of protest are most muted. And over the last few years, we've seen steps after steps. For instance, the reforms in the foreign direct investment in India have been significantly expanded, and today we've become one of the most open economies in the world. The conditionalities attached to the earlier FDI entry into India have been rationalized, almost eliminated. Almost 90% of the investment that comes into India comes through the automatic route. The 10% which used to come with prior permissions, even those have been extremely simplified in the latest round of reforms that we've undertaken in India. And we've become, over the last few years, one of the largest recipients of foreign direct investment anywhere in the world itself. One of the great challenges in India was, and we were struggling over the years to find a solution to this, an issue on which the CAG as an institution also had made comments and made several sets of recommendations. In the process of enlarging economic activity, how are resources, particularly natural resources and other resources of the state, to be distributed? Is that to be done on the basis of a discretion to be vested in the government, and those discretions eventually exercised by men on basis of the policy that is formulated at that time? Because once you have discretions, there will always be two views as to how those discretions have been exercised and how value determinations in those discretions have taken place. And therefore, I think the maturity of the Indian system prevailed, and we've now linked allocations of virtually all resources to the market mechanism and eliminated any form of discretion that men may exercise. The price determination and the choice of the beneficiary now depends on a transparent system, which is a result of the experience that the Indian administrative system has learned from our experiences of the past itself. Now, this was a very major reform because this has helped us in getting rid of all controversies, not allowing any fingers to be pointed, and therefore without any fear of consequences, decisions to be expeditiously taken as far as those areas are concerned. India is a federal state. We have a large number of regional governments. There's a shared sovereignty as far as the center and the states are concerned. Economic activity is carried on at both the level of the center and the states. And therefore, a very major reform has been, and we take a decision with regard to sharing of resources between the central government and the state governments every 5 years through what we call the Finance Commission mechanism. And this share of the regions has now expanded. That is, the size of the resource which is made available from the taxation pool to the states itself has expanded. And therefore, there is a greater decentralization of the resource which itself has taken place. A very major reform and change, which is work in progress in India, is taking place both in the field of direct and indirect taxation. As far as direct taxation is concerned, we are trying to make sure that our systems are fair, discretions and arbitrariness gets reduced, technology is used to the optimum purpose, and the rates are really at the international level. We have therefore decided that in the due course, the initial steps in that direction we have already taken. Our corporate rate of taxation, which in India used to be exorbitantly high in the pre-liberalization stage before 1991, and is now pegged at 30% plus some surcharge, is to be brought down eventually at 25%, which is at par with the best global practices. This year already, we've taken a major step forward, and 96% of companies in India which operate in the small and the medium sector have all been brought down to the 25% level itself. But the biggest reform in India which has taken place, and I always regard it as one of the biggest taxation reforms in India since independence, is what we are in the process of trying to implement from the 1st of July this year, is the goods and services tax. Today we have one of the most complicated indirect taxation systems in India. Taxation on manufacture is charged by the central government. Taxation on sales is charged by the regional governments. The regional governments have several other forms of taxation, from luxury to entertainment to purchase to octroi, that is entry into the city. The central government charges a services tax. And therefore, any person doing business activity which operates through the country has not only to deal with the central government, but every time he passes through one of the regions of the country, and we have close to 30 regions, really has to submit to the taxation authority of that region, each having a different level of taxation. There are different kinds of taxations, and therefore he has to face multiple assessing authorities. Each time he pays tax, he also pays tax on the tax component that he has already paid, making his goods and services slightly costlier. So India, despite being one political entity, is not a single economic entity. It's divided into multiple economic entities. Each charges multiple layers of taxation, with no input credits being available in many cases. In what I regard, as I said, the single important tax reform, we've amended the Constitution of India abolished all these taxes and substituted all of them for one single tax, which is called the Goods and Services Tax. And therefore, all taxes have been subsumed into one tax. There'll be a seamless transfer of goods and services across the country. Each assessee has to face only one assessing authority. Administratively, they are trying to reach an arrangement that the IT backbone of this taxation system is so strong that being a more efficient system, evasion is inherently more difficult. And therefore, taxation itself, it increases the volumes of taxation. There is no tax on tax already paid, and therefore that makes goods, commodities, and services a little cheaper, far more convenient, and only limited number of cases taken up for scrutiny. Otherwise, all cases to be accepted as the IT system really is counterbalances and checks any possible evasion. So once implemented, what is currently one of the most complicated systems across the world will become one of the simplest taxation systems in the world. We've passed the Constitution Amendment. The laws which enable this are now before Parliament, which hopefully should get cleared. And once they do get cleared, then by the middle of this year, we hope to see the implementation as far as this law is concerned. We've undertaken several other major reforms, just as we have a very easy entry into businesses by a completely de-licensed system. We are making the exit from business also easier, and therefore you have a proper insolvency law which has been in place, which has now become itself operational. One important measure which has been both domestically and globally commented upon, which the government of India had undertaken late last year, was to demonetize the high-value currency. I have no hesitation in admitting that in terms of tax compliances, India would rank fairly high as a tax non-compliant state. Both in the matter of direct and indirect taxation, non-compliance hugely exists. And therefore, one of the efforts of the state has been how to bring this non-compliance itself to an end. As I said, in the indirect taxation system, once the new system is introduced, it will be a great check as far as evasion is concerned. We've amended a lot of our provisions of the direct taxation law to make curbs on expenditure in terms of cash currency. And one of the vices in the Indian economy that we witnessed was that there was a predominant use of cash as an instrument of exchange as against cards or any other form of checks or digitization in the economy itself. In fact, the cash component of Indian economy, the currency on paper that existed, was exorbitantly high, about 12.2% of the total GDP itself. And of this 12.2% cash of the GDP, which was the cash currency, 86% was high denominational currency. And therefore, the tendency to deal excessively in cash did exist, and a tendency to deal excessively in cash created its own challenges for the economy. Cash facilitates crime, cash facilitated corruption, cash incentivized tax non-compliance, and India, having been on the receiving end of insurgency and terrorism in various parts of the country, this was an important facilitator as far as those offenses against the state was concerned. And therefore, the government took a decision on the 8th of November last year to declare this high denominational currency as not a legally valid tender anymore. And people were given time to exchange it for the alternative currency which was brought in. Now, one positive impact this has had is that the anonymity which was attached to this high level of cash operating in the market, that anonymity disappeared because all that cash had to be deposited against a given name in a bank account. So large amounts of money have entered the banking system, and hopefully the width of the banking transactions itself increases. This has also increased and will continue to increase the trend towards a further digitization of the economy, act as a disincentive about continuing to deal in a shadow economy or in a parallel economy, and lead to a further integration of this informal economy with the formal economy. So as we foresee ahead, the size of India's GDP in the years to come will be bigger, size of the formal economy increases, and hopefully will be cleaner itself. As far as India's growth is concerned, we've consistently been maintaining a growth rate, notwithstanding the global slowdown, between 7 and 8%. And this growth rate has been amongst the highest amongst the large economies of the world. Our basic economic parameters seem to be, at least the data seems to be auguring well. Our fiscal deficit is under control. Our current account deficit is well within control. Our inflation targeting is at about 4%. We seem to be within those targets itself. How do we see the future course as far as India is concerned? I would emphasize on two very important areas that India has to concentrate on. The first is continuing to build on infrastructure on almost a war footing. For instance, India today has one of the largest infrastructure creation programs anywhere in the world. We target 10,000 kilometers of national highways every year, which in simple language translates into 30 kilometers a day. We are still slightly short of that target, but hopefully we'll be moving closer to that target. By 2019, we hope to connect every village in India with a regular road. By 2018, we hope to ensure that there is not a single village in India which is not electrified. And then we take the next step forward. And for instance, other areas of infrastructure which I have not referred to, we have a huge program on expansion of regional airports. We have about 70 to 75 functional airports today in India. And the idea over the next few years is to add around 40 to 50 more regional airports, so that almost every part of the country is connected with the air connectivity itself. Stations in all important cities of India, which are now going to be redeveloped by the private sector itself. The initial set of contracts have now already been being awarded. I think the second very important area, which I partly indicated, and that is where the future growth in India is going to come from, is the development of rural India itself. And therefore, rural India, there's still a huge gap between urban India and rural India. And therefore, rural India, as I said, needs road connectivity, a program which is fairly successful. It needs electrification, a program which is fairly successful. It now needs the next challenge, which is currently on, that we are trying to make sure, as a part of our cleanliness campaign, that every rural house has access to a toilet system, which conventionally did not exist. Rural houses or regular rural houses is a major target, and millions of houses are to be created year after year to make sure by 2022 we are able to provide housing in the rural areas itself. A very high level of investment in rural irrigation, in animal husbandry and dairy farming, and all other modes of investment in rural areas, including interest subvention, including providing employment to those who don't otherwise get employment as a part of the state support system, so that the additional resources of the state go into those areas where poverty levels are high, so that we can deplete those poverty levels over the next few years. And therefore, I see this resource coming into India over the next few years being substantially spent on rural India and on infrastructure itself. What then are the key challenges today? I think one area of uncertainty always has been for India the oil prices itself. We are net buyers as far as oil is concerned, and therefore the current price regime is a price regime which suits India. And therefore, over the last 2 to 3 years, we have benefited from the oil prices itself. That's one area of uncertainty which always remains. There are two other areas. One, of course, is linked to the pace at which growth returns to the rest of the world, because that also impacts on India, particularly as far as our international trade is concerned. But the key area is, whereas our public investment levels are high, our foreign direct investment levels are high, our consumptions are slightly increasing, our private sector investment has to increase, which has also something to do with the health of some of our public sector banks, which as a part of the slowdown process which related to certain industries had also got adversely impacted, a problem which we are now trying to address, and I am hopeful that over the next few quarters we'll probably see a better result as far as those areas are concerned. How do I see I certainly do believe that India, despite global slowdown in the world, will continue to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And if growth, as it did in the last decade, returns in a bigger way to the world, it certainly has a capacity to give a greater impetus as far as the Indian economy is concerned. Well, thank you very much once again.